Hello, this is Dan Wright from Shadowproof.com interviewing Robbie Martin, director, filmmaker of a very heavy agenda film series. Um, so far, so good. um, Robbie, let me ask you, what separates the third installment from the other installments of the film?
Well, hi Daniel. Thank you for having me. Um, well, I mean, part three, of course, is the conclusion to the trilogy. Um, it sounds funny even referring to it as a trilogy, but it started originally as one movie and it ballooned into three over the course of working on it, just because one movie wasn't enough time to tell the story. Um, so part three. It was an opportunity to kind of go over the whole Kagan family, as opposed to just Robert Kagan and some of the other neoconservatives who founded the Project for the New American Century, like Bill Kristol, Gary Schmidt. Part one of the movie kind of starts with the founders of Project for the New American Century, or PNAC, and kind of moves from there, showing where they went, where they went after Obama became president, and what they did sort of after the war on terror became um, not as much of a useful narrative for them anymore. So part three kind of starts, um, I guess, in the second half of the Obama presidency, in his second term, sort of already in the midst of a Ukraine conflict, two proxy wars between Russia and the United States, one in Syria, one in Ukraine, and just sort of showing how the neocons helped push us into both of these situations, and how they became increasingly unhappy with uh, the way that Obama was approaching both these situations. And as someone who's very critical of the Obama administration and his foreign policy, it was surprising to me while making this movie to see that the neocons were on board with him at the very beginning, and even as hawkish and as neoconservative as Obama's foreign policies were, they were they it wasn't enough for them, and they became unhappy with it, and they started to put more pressure on him and started to sort of turn various members in the press against his foreign policy, but not against it in like a good adversarial way, but against it in the sense that they wanted him to be more hawkish. They wanted him not to do the Iran deal, all those kinds of things. They wanted him to fund more Syrian rebels in Syria. They wanted him to instate a no-fly zone and actually overthrow Assad. So anything you can imagine that would be more hawkish than what Obama's already doing, all these neoconservatives want him to do. In part three, I guess that's sort of the starting point in part three. And the Kagan family in and of themselves, even though there are a lot of other war makers and neocons in DC, I found the Kagan family in particular very fascinating because they are very, very influential, and sort of, you just go one layer back into the power corridors, and it's very obvious that Robert Kagan is extremely well respected, very influential. But the difference between him and a lot of these other influential figures, everybody knows who Henry Kissinger is, for example, and some of these other famous foreign policy strategists. But Robert Kagan is someone who, in I don't know if this was his intention or not, but he has managed to stay off the radar of sort of the public's understanding of foreign policy making, and by proxy, his entire family. His wife, Victoria Nuland, holds an extremely important position in the State Department. In part three, I sort of show that her trajectory seems perfectly poised to kind of, move up to actually become Secretary of State if Hillary becomes president. And then you have Robert Kagan's sister-in-law, Kimberly Kagan, who runs arguably one of the most innocuous seeming think tanks about war in DC, called the Institute for the Study of War. And it's barely ever questioned by anybody. And their data is used every day. And, you pick up any newspaper, major newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, New York Times, you could pick up any of these papers and find at least one analytic from the Institute for the Study of War, whether it be a map, statistics, some kind of on the ground reporting, and it has sort of this perception when you look at it that it's not biased, that it's just data, that these are all really hardworking people just culling together all this data to help inform people, but then you find out that it's all funded by defense contractors like Raytheon and stuff. This actual think tank's data, how they gather their data, and all their employees are, their salaries are paid for by weapons manufacturers.
Or go ahead, please.
Oh no, that's the end of my my rant.
Okay. I actually, what's really interesting from my perspective of this film, as opposed to some of the other stuff, is your ability to link together a phenomenon that a lot of people don't understand, which is that there was and continues to be a propaganda mechanism within the U.S. government. People don't look at the U.S. government and see there being a propaganda mechanism, or that there's these official state media. But when and this is why it's so valuable to watch this film, is you go from Robert Kagan in the 80s, when he is with the Office of Information and is using his powers of persuasion, using what he even calls propaganda. You have clips of him calling it propaganda, to win people over to the Nicaraguan war cause. He ultimately would be connected to Iran-Contra, but not enough to really get burned, kind of like the Iraq War. He's connected, but he doesn't really get touched. And it's interesting to see that what the Kagans, that sort of is part of the neocon apparatus, if you will, the group, is they really understand how to work with the media, because many of them not only worked within U.S. state media, but they work with media through these think tanks, whether it be the American Enterprise Institute, which is partly founded, I think, or at least led at one time by Irving Kristol, William Kristol's father. Fred Kagan's now a part of that. You have these seemingly neutral think tanks, quote-unquote neutral, with Kimberly Kagan. And you have Bob Kagan now taking a more emeritus role as a sort of elder statesman. But at the same time, you have a corresponding push by the younger neocons into things like the Interpreter mag, into things like Radio Free Liberty, Jamie Kirchick. So it kind of seems like these people, one thing they get, they may not have a lot of public support, but they really understand how to work the media. And if you could, and your film really goes into that, this one in particular. So can you expand on what do you think the linkage is between the neoconservative group and their ability to influence media and be part of it, either directly or indirectly?
Oh, I think that's one of the most important components of all this. And I mean, there's a clip I play towards the very end of the movie, and it's not too much of a spoiler because it just kind of goes along with the whole theme that you're talking about, where Donald Kagan explains that his son Robert taught him a lot about modern politics and the way that foreign policy is sort of dictated and perceived through the media, that it's that domestic politics here in this country drastically affect America's ability to sell and wage a war. That's kind of what he's saying. And I think that's a point I really wanted to drive home in part 3, is that for some reason or another, the neoconservatives are incredibly skilled at using the media as an instrument to sort of get their message out there. And before, right after 9/11, this is another thing I try to emphasize in my film, is that sort of what I would describe as a neoconservative 1.0, sort of the original iteration right after 9/11 of what neoconservatives were doing, is they were, it was almost like, I would almost describe it like a fire sale, almost like their greed was so out of control that the things they were trying to put out into the media are absurd. I mean, and that's even being kind. I mean, they're actually horrifying.
Like invade Palestine.
Yeah, they wanted to invade Palestine. They were eager for another attack to happen already on the day of 9/11. I mean, this is how greedy these people were. Even they knew that 9/11 wouldn't be enough to get some of this stuff they wanted done. So they were all, hoping that there'd be a biological attack, which there actually was, not 3 weeks after 9/11. So it's just, there's so many layers of greed and hubris that was in the original iteration of the neoconservatives. That's all, it's all out there. You can find most of it. So what I try to do is sort of show all that together, some of the worst of that, to show how originally this is how crazy they sounded in the media. And then over time, they started to massage and sort of revamp and change the wording of, and actually make their rhetoric, their warmongering sound more reasonable and not like obvious warmongering. They rebranded. Right. And that, and I think that is what, to me, that's what's been so impressive, is all of these people, Michael Weiss, interpreter, just, seemingly organically, they have all developed a similar skill. But then when you start peeling back the layers of like Interpreter Mag, you even find out that Peter Pomerantsev, who I would argue is one of the most skilled of these propagandists of them all, you can trace back his paper that he wrote with Michael Weiss, to an Interpreter Mag published paper. Yet when Interpreter Mag published it, it was, supposedly a private entity. That's how people perceived it. Yet it had an obvious anti-Russian leaning. But, a year and a half later, we now know that it's been bought. It's an acquired property of RFERL, a U.S. state-funded entity. So it does raise the question of, was it always a U.S. state-funded entity, just a front, or was it actually bought out by RFERL later on? It honestly, I think both right. possibilities are equally likely.
Well, and also remember, private is interesting, but what it actually was supported by Karadovsky, one of the Russian oligarchs. His son actually started Interpreter Mag, or provided the financing for the Interpreter Mag. So
through the IMR.
Yeah. So in the case, this was a private publication, quote unquote private, funded by a disgraced Russian oligarch who, very complicated history. We can go into it. Yes, he's opposing an authoritarian government to some degree, but also, yes, he's completely guilty of what they accused him of. So it's, he's he's not a white hat, and I think it's really, I don't even think he's a gray hat. I think he's a black hat, given that he said his goal is to violently overthrow the government, which would hurt a lot of people. So I don't even think that. But so there's a private entity-ish, private-ish. Now it's a state property. And I think I want to go back to something you said that was important about right after 9/11 and a larger point, or a sort of dynamic people analysis. I guess Naomi Klein wrote a book about this. A lot of people about disaster capitalism. But it's really about, and there was this famous phrase from Rahm Emanuel that became conservatives love to whine about, called a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, which is sort of a rule of politics, which is, there's certain things that are openings, right? And I guess the worst example, of course, or worst historical example that comes to mind is the Reichstag fire, which the Nazis themselves set, but it provided a pretext for a real big crackdown in Germany of dissidents and other people. And so that's in case they did it. I'm not making any reference to that in this case. But once a crisis happens, people see the opportunity, and like you said, you talk about greed, but it's kind of like a shopping list. So, for example, the intelligence community wanted the Patriot Act, has wanted that for years. And after 9/11 and the anthrax attacks, they didn't come up. They just sit down in a room and beat out these policies for 48 hours or something. They took all they had on the shelf and said, "Here's our opportunity to finally get it." And so it seems like when the neocons saw 9/11 happen, they said, "Here's an opportunity. Look at this. We've got almost a blank check here. Let's not just get Saddam. Let's overthrow Iran. Let's invade the Palestinian territories, even though they had nothing to do with it." And that's what the dynamic seems to be, is that the neocons very much recognize something I think everybody should recognize, which is politics is kind of, I'll quote Mao Zedong, because why not? History is a boiling pot. There's kind of these moments where there's an opening, and you go in and you get everything you want. And I think the neocons seem to have understood that very well. And yes, they're greedy and they're disappointed they didn't get more, but objectively speaking, they got a lot. They got 2 wars. They got an incredible expansion of the security state. they've got now still, I mean, regime change still seems to be the order of the day. They got that from the Obama administration. So do you think are the neocons greedy, or are they just very astute?
I think it's both. I mean, I think you have some of them who are obviously very astute and had all these. I mean, like you mentioned the Patriot Act. I mean, another example is the Hart-Rudman report, which was done under the Clinton administration, and it essentially was all the framework and all the recommendations for what the Homeland Security Agency later became. So they already had that sort of, you know, they were looking for an excuse to put in something like that as well. And but I think, you know, with Don and Fred Kagan, I think you almost have something more than just you know, being astute. I think that it was greed. I mean, I think that it's hard to make the distinction, you know, that, you know, if you line up all these neocons and say, you know, these ones were worse than some of these other ones, it's difficult to do that. But I really do think you can with Don and Fred Kagan, because, or even someone like James Woolsey, who right after 9/11, they are very clearly trying to expand it beyond just we're retaliating against the terrorists who attacked us. You know, even beyond just state actors who support terrorism. I think at one point in the phone call with Don and Fred Kagan, they actually say any entity or any group that's even thinking about doing anything like this, we should attack them regardless of if they had anything to do with this. So I think that that's an interesting mindset that is you know, I would describe as very greedy and sort of chomping at the bit. It's almost, I mean, it was almost like they saw the opportunity and they just wanted to kind of, you know, break through the wall like the Kool-Aid man, you know, when they saw that's how excited they were. And they couldn't contain themselves. I mean, that's kind of how I see it. So I think it's definitely a mixture.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I definitely, the way I read it, and I think Woolsey was someone who I wasn't even aware of until I started watching your films and seeing your work, because he wrote some things for the New Republic, really making outlandish claims. But what I kind of see it as, and I don't know if you see it this way, I kind of got this from the film, but it wasn't, is like there's a larger worldview. And Don Kagan actually said something that echoes, ironically, the British view of a British imperial officer said of Palestine, which was, he said, the British officer said, you know, Arabs only understand the heavy hand. And Don Kagan said, in the clip, you have the clip, says, you know, Arabs only respect us when we're strong, which is really the same sentiment. And it seems like there's a kind of, you know, there's a formal, you know, things we could do, and then there's this sort of larger atmosphere we want to change, this sort of paradigm of, you know, we need to just go out there and put a hit on somebody so people understand that they can't ever mess with us again. Mm-hmm. And we don't really care exactly if we hit the right people, because it's not really about specific objectives. It's about sending a larger message. Absolutely. And that of course is a recipe for unrestrained violence and limitless unintended consequences. So what do you think of that? That's really about this larger struggle that isn't even necessarily grounded in reality. It's just sort of a sort of mental space struggle that other people aren't even necessarily perceiving.
Well, I think that is, I mean, I think that's the larger thing that's going on here. I definitely think, you know, and I hesitate to use the word psyop because, you know, it's usually associated with some kind of like CIA or black operation kind of thing. But I do think what some of these neocons were doing is they were sort of putting out this intentional psyop kind of mindset that it wasn't just about retaliating against people, you know, or striking terrorists that are harboring other terrorists. I mean, I'm sure on some surface level that was their sales pitch, but I think what you just hit on is the greater, I mean, was their reasoning for going to do this is almost kind of like a mafia-like symbolic intimidation on a global scale. And you can hear it most evidently in James Woolsey's remarks, where he's saying that we're not going to get caught up in legal niceties. We're not going to have to be, we're not going to be put up to the burden of proof about why we're going to attack Iraq or any other country in response to 9/11. We're just going to do this, and everybody's pretty much just going to have to get out of our way. And I think that that's the more important sort of neocon talking point that they tried to put out, right after 9/11, which arguably, I mean, if you combine it with a lot of the other stuff on 9/11, like the dancing Palestinian footage that was shown on television, things like that, I mean, it really did, I believe, activate sort of a very visceral, bloodthirsty reaction inside of us that, for some people right now, Donald Trump is doing that in them. Sort of this, like, we need to blow up the whole Middle East, we need to let them fight each other and pick up the remnants. It's a similar mindset, but I think I would argue it was far more dangerous when it was put out there on 9/11 because of what was happening, at the time. I mean, we were in a state of emotional hysteria, and the neocons, I don't think that they were. I mean, you could argue, right, they got caught up in it. I don't think they did. That's the scary part. They were very, very level-headed while they were putting out this stuff, and they knew what they were putting out. And to me, that's the frightening and most dangerous part about this, is they took advantage of a very intense, scary time to try to tip the balance in a very dangerous direction. And I would argue that they largely succeeded in doing that. I mean, we kind of got a pause from sort of the ramping up Islamophobia, terrorism hysteria, before ISIS sort of came out of nowhere, and now it's kind of just back on again. I feel like that trajectory, that ramping up effect that the neocons created, is now, we're back in it, and to me it's frightening.
And that goes to a point that you made in your film that I think is very interesting about, probably, I think Bob Kagan is the case in point, but has also been made by other journalists in the ramp up to Syria, which is this idea that, you talked about the ramp up about after 9/11. What stopped them was not the American public or the electorate. What stopped them was Iraq. They got what they wanted. They just couldn't handle what they wanted. They got what they asked for. They got the war they asked for, and then the U.S. was, I know this might be controversial to say, pretty much defeated. And at least its stated objectives, which were pretty stupid. But so even its real objectives, I'm not sure, really worked out. So it's not like the neocons were ever intellectually defeated in any sense. Their policies failed, and then as soon as their policies failed, they jumped away, retreated, and left, George Bush and these other figures, Rumsfeld, to just sit there and take all the fire, waited it out, and then lurched on to the next group, or latched on to the next group. And that's what's interesting about, some of the reporters said, why should the people who led us into Iraq, or the media, particularly the pundits and journalists who advocated Iraq, why do they still have jobs? Why do they do it? It's such a disaster. And you also point out that Bob Kagan has been completely rehabilitated, that he sort of smartly stepped away from the more extremist elements of the neocons, the people who really, I think, unmuzzled themselves, not just Woolsey, but like Ledeen, although I'm not sure that guy ever muzzles himself. But and that they kind of wrote it out and have moderated their views, sort of changed it around, and except for Bill Kristol, who I think has been pretty well discredited, mostly by his own actions, it seems like the neocons are still going very strong. So talk about the lack of consequence for poor advocacy, because that's what it looks like to me. It looks like they ramped up, took advantage, and then most of them are sitting pretty and are positioning themselves to be with the Clinton administration, the next Clinton administration.
Yeah, I mean, it seems almost like there's no accountability. I mean, even like someone like Bill Kristol, who is not taken seriously by most people, he's considered a joke. Even he still gets on television, all the time. He has semi-permanent gigs on ABC. He's always on CNN and MSNBC. So it really doesn't seem like ultimately there is any accountability for these people. And then you have like people like Richard Pearl and Michael Ledeen, who are maybe a little more tarnished. They didn't really survive I mean, they're still probably working now, but I don't think I would argue that somehow they didn't survive as well as Bill Kristol did. He still is obviously making quite a bit of money appearing on TV and stuff. And, the Weekly Standard is still doing well, apparently, even though Donald Trump says it's tanking. He couldn't remember the name of it several times when he talked about it. But yeah, no, it is interesting, and I this is maybe a crass analogy to use, but it does kind of remind me of like a battered wife syndrome, kind of almost like a Stockholm syndrome kind of effect, where it's like, I mean, that actually maybe a better way to say this is, I think that we all hold some blame. I include myself in this, and I would include any journalist, who allowed any ground to be taken by these neocons, and that's happened so many times since 9/11 that it's really hard to count them all up. I mean, and I harp on this point a lot, and I annoy Abby with it sometimes because I bring it up on the podcast all the time. But the Afghanistan war is something that I think that, because we didn't really push hard enough against that and sort of the moral framework for that, just that alone, I think, allows the neocons to be able to continue and to be able to almost out-argue us, for example, because there's a scene I use in part 3 during the section about ISIS, and it's kind of a scene that goes by really fast. It's maybe not that noteworthy, but the point that the guy makes to Bill Kristol is really interesting, because he's like, we're not going to listen to you and get into a third war in the Middle East, a third endeavor in the Middle East. And Bill Kristol's like, well, what was the first war? What was the second war? The first war was Afghanistan. Like, you didn't disagree with that, did you?
Right.
Like, we should have done that.
Exactly.
So it's almost kind of like, I mean, I have to give the neocons credit that they are excellent at debating people and being very manipulative at it, because the left has a lot of what I would argue weak spots, where the neocons can sort of jab into those spots and be like, well, you supported this. I mean, and an interesting example of that, and this kind of hinted to me that Hillary Clinton was getting some advice from some neocons, or maybe even Robert Kagan, is there was a point during that Chris Matthews interview, that really surprisingly adversarial one, where she brings up that Bernie Sanders voted for sort of the overthrowing Saddam bill that was passed in I think in 1999 or actually maybe even 2000 under Bill Clinton, that Bernie Sanders voted for that, which the neocons at that time knew that bill was sort of an underhanded way to eventually get to overthrowing Saddam Hussein. It was sort of like a bill, pledging to support, the rebels or whoever was opposed to him, to take him out of office. And I think that that's an interesting example of just how, I guess what I'm saying is that,
right, they box people in. What they do is say, it's like, look, you agree with our objective, right? And once people say that, and then they say, well, then this is just a question of tactics, and we don't think your tactics work. The only way to defeat that is to say, no, I don't agree with your objective, and I don't agree with your worldview. But what Democrats and liberal interventionists never say, or have no interest in saying, is we disagree with your objectives. So, for example, when the neocons come out and say, Assad's a terrible man, he's the next Hitler, we got to get rid of him, he's destroying people, and people say, yes, we agree. Okay, we need to go to war in Syria. Well, we're not sure we're ready for a war. Oh, so you're okay with, you just said Assad to be overthrown, so you're okay with mass murder and barrel bombs? So I think the liberals are just suckers. They're such suckers, and they get boxed in, and then they look like they're weak, because they're saying they believe in something, and then every time they're asked about ways to achieve it, they look like they don't have the power of their convictions, that they believe in things but they're not willing to execute, when the actual response to neoconservatism is to say, no, I don't agree with your objectives. Your objectives are wrong. Your worldviews are wrong. America is not an exceptional nation. Imperialism is wrong. And so when people do that half measure, I agree that the neocons, the greatest example I think I've seen this cycle, and there's been a few good ones, is the neocons trolling Rand Paul into signing the Iran war letter, which was by Tom Cotton, who's probably the most neoconservative, very close to the neoconservatives, and they wrote this very bellicose letter that really looked like it was a call for war. Now that doesn't mean it was going to be, but that's what it was like signing the overthrow the Iraq resolution in the 90s. And Rand Paul signed it, and it blew away all his credibility, because now it just looks like, yes, he wants Iran to go, yes, he wants regime change, but he's just a coward and won't man up to follow through. What he should have said is, I don't believe in regime change. So they're very good at trolling people. That's what these little petitions, and people from the outside of D.C. and they don't say, well, who cares if you sign a pledge or you sign a petition? Grover Norquist has been jamming people in the Republican Party for a generation because they signed a no tax increase pledge, and he goes, I'm just going to tell the voters, you signed a pledge, you broke your word. So that's what they're very good at. They're very good at jamming their opponents or seeming opponents into either going along with them or looking weak because they've already conceded the premise, I think, is my take on it. What do you think?
No, I completely agree with what you just said. And I think that in part 3, I also try to show, I don't know how well I show this, but I try to show how part of the reason why neoconservatives are so successful at boxing people in like this, especially liberals, is because they come from, they are rooted in liberal ideology. I mean, a lot of neoconservatism stems from a great understanding of liberalism as a belief system. And you even see, Robert Kagan taking it sort of to the next sort of like argumentative debate framework, to try to box someone in by saying, well, liberal internationalism is in conflict with the idea of international law, because you can't, respect international law if it means you can't respect another nation's sovereignty if you believe in international liberalism, is what he's saying, because that would mean you would have to violate a nation's sovereignty to impose your liberalism, which is like sort of the overriding belief system. So therefore you can't have international law and global liberalism at the same time. They can't coexist. And I mean, it's like he's really trying to drive that point home as yet another excuse for why we need to intervene in these foreign countries for essentially liberalism, and that's how he sells it. And I just find that it's just fascinatingly deceptive. I mean, and at a certain level, I have to stress that a lot of these people are very well read in, and they understand Machiavellian philosophy very well. And I mean, and there's a lot of Machiavellian philosophy that sort of is I guess goes along with what you're saying, sort of boxing people in, with this idea that peace through force, is sort of the right path. And there's so many ways to box a liberal in with that, because liberals want peace. They just don't want to do it with force, but if they have to, they can be coaxed into it.
Yeah, their liberal peace is, a piece of you here, a piece of you there. But I think that's a key point. And what's interesting is in this film, you go very deep. I think you take it into the current events, so there is kind of a timeline in the trilogy, but you also work in more of the background. Irving Kristol comes in, Donald Kagan, what you call the section, the patriarchs. And what you'll see is they're from the left. So you could look at it one way as this Machiavellian tactics, which I would agree they are, but you could also look at it as a sort of a kind of Leninist heighten the contradictions. If liberalism means freedom for people everywhere, liberation for women everywhere, if those are universal truths, which is what one version of liberalism certainly says, then how can you not spread it? If this is the truth, then how can this not be spread? Which sounds a lot like people on the other side of the battle, I believe. But so there is that understanding that there's some contradictions, and there is a clip that you play in the film that's really revealing, with Bob Kagan saying you can't really square international law that's going to recognize sovereignty, that's going to recognize limits, and be a liberal internationalist, because you'll come into conflict. And it seems like one of their tactics or one of their strategies is to heighten that contradiction. And that seems to drive a lot of it. And it seems to also, honestly, confound a lot of the quote-unquote left-of-center liberals, people who are in the Anna Marie Slaughter's in the film, in that debate that you feature. I believe that's a Bloomberg Intelligence Squared debate. And she's someone who's clearly constantly getting swayed back and forth and looking incredibly incoherent on issues, because she's trying to be both a liberal and yet somehow respect international law. And with something like, for example, she's in the Hillary emails about Libya, and they're trying to talk about how Libya could be argued to be a liberal intervention, but other people are going to say it's just very destructive. And so it seems like those are the real prey of the neocons. They really know how to screw center-left liberals into looking incoherent and contradiction, and eventually they just kind of go along with it. And because the neocons are so good at the media, it seems like they can almost, at least before, promise them some cover if they go along with this. What do you think of that?
I think it's absolutely. I think they need these sort of fence sitter, left center people. They need them. It's sort of the engine that they need to be able to have their policy fully soak in. And what's so impressive to me is that they were able to do this so well under Obama, which I guess I just didn't really expect, that they would be able to, get so many liberal interventionist type people, centrist liberals, to go along with so much of this stuff under him. And I don't show the whole debate in my movie, but it's interesting the way Robert Kagan is debating with her is he's actually quoting her most of the time to try to shove back in her face that she is echoing his own neocon points. And he does it several times throughout the debate, and she's kind of just left, not really knowing how to respond. So it's a perfect example of him boxing, her in that example, and then a bunch of people by proxy. But it made me think of Sam Harris when you were talking about this, because I think he is a perfect example of sort of someone who is not part of this neocon push necessarily. He's not part of this neocon cabal, but his belief system has sort of sprung up out of sort of that, in heightening those contradictions that you're talking about that the neocons have done. Because ultimately, sort of the new atheist, Islam is a bad ideology sort of mindset that's spread among sort of these young liberals does come from that, I think. Because at a certain point, it's like, well, of course, Islam is anti-liberal, so why aren't you speaking out against it? It gets to that level, and I think that what the neocons have done and through heightening those contradictions is they've taken it that far, where there's little organic movements now popping up that sort of cut through the left and are like trying to make people on the left, face their hypocrisy about, not being liberal enough about these certain issues. And I think that's, we're seeing that kind of happening all over the place. I mean, Syria is a great example of something where there's a ton of people still sitting on the fence on the left about that. Even after we know how long the CIA has been meddling in there. So I would argue that those are, especially Syria has been very successful for the neocons, at least on the PR level.
Right, and they pull people more to, if we're on a spectrum, say the right is imperialism or expansion, interventionism, and they pull people there, and the compromise is not nothing or non-interventionism. The compromise is cruise missile liberalism, and that's what you've seen with Obama. So Obama, when he breaks with the neocons, he doesn't say, I'm going to look for strategies other than military force. He says, I'm just going to do drone strikes and kill people at their weddings by accident. And I'm doing the kill list. I'm going to do that. I'm not going to do nothing. I'm not going to look for diplomatic solutions. I'm not going to try to restructure our imperial positioning in the world. I'm just going to meet you halfway. I'm going to do these half measures. That's what old critique from the left about liberals is. Liberals are people who view the argument from all sides and then cut the baby in half. And so it's like, well, okay, I won't do another ground force operation like you guys want. You guys are sort of concern trolling me into doing something, so I'll just do bombing. I'll just do cruise missiles. I'll just do special forces. And that's how the liberals can continually get pushed and boxed into doing their limited military engagement. But if they weren't getting pulled to the right on that spectrum, they might actually be thinking about ways to avoid military intervention in the first place. So even when the neocons, quote-unquote, fail, they kind of succeed because cruise missile liberalism does just look like a half measure, and then when it doesn't work, which it never does, it doesn't look like military force hasn't worked, it looks like half measures haven't worked. So the solution is not to say we've been killing people and the problem hasn't gotten better. The solution then looks like, because we're upset because we got attacked again, the solution is full in. Go full in, because obviously half measures don't work. So they're very good at that.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's so many things that I couldn't cover in my movie. I spent so long researching this and just sort of combing through, statements of different neocons, and there's characters that don't even appear in the movie, like Rumsfeld, for example. I mean, the neocons ended up hating Rumsfeld, kind of based on what you're saying, is the neocons wanted to frame the Iraq War from the very, very beginning as that the Bush administration was doing a half measure, and that it wasn't doing it right, wasn't strategizing it right, wasn't sending enough troops. And that's the line that the neocons took, and of course, after Obama pulled out, then they took the idea that that was a half measure. He didn't keep the troops long enough. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, even something as crazy as the Iraq War, where over 200,000 people to 1 million people died based on our invasion, that to them that was a half measure, and to them they see it, if we had gone full in and sent the right amount of troops, I don't know if they thought we should send in twice the amount. I'm not exactly sure, that it would have been a success. So they're always trying to spin it, and I think that that's a really important point, is that if a liberal interventionist president does a cruise missile strike or a drone strike, they can always use that as an excuse and say, well, that was just, a pinprick, and now we need to take, a sledgehammer in and
right.
that kind of stuff. I mean, and that's what we've seen. We've seen creep in Syria. I've described this on the Media Roots podcast with Abby a bunch. It's a sort of the new thing we're seeing in Syria is it started at the very lowest level of like acceptability. We sent in a helicopter to pick up the Yazidis off the mountaintop. It's like the most ultimate humanitarian. Nobody would disagree with doing that, But then right after that, that's when then you start seeing, special forces going in, training the rebels. And then all of a sudden, hundreds of special forces, and then airstrikes, and then proposals for no-fly zone. So it's
new military bases. Now we have a military base in Syria and northern Iraq.
Yeah, and then when ISIS, took over the territory that had the dam, it was kind of like, we need to go in to protect the dam. I mean, there's always something. They're always trying to creep us more and more into this, and I think Syria, it's just very interesting when you chronologically map it all out, how many different levels of that have happened so far. I'm not even going all the way back to the Assad, supposed Assad chemical weapons attack, which was their first big push to try to get us into Syria.
Right, and that's actually a great example of this dynamic, because they trolled Obama into saying, "I have a red line." Right. Then they kind of invented, I would argue, it's a controversy, we don't exactly know, but somebody used some kind of chemical weapon and said, boom, you said red line, now you have to go in. And when he didn't, because he knew the consequences of going in and there was public protest, they said, well, what a failure. I mean, he didn't enforce his own red line, but you got him to put the red line in. So it's a great little trap they set up.
I just want to mention really quick, to me, that's, arguably one of the most, and it sounds almost stupid to say, but it's one of the most courageous moments of his presidency, that he, with all that pressure, and because that framework and boxing in effect was happening to make him look like a total hypocrite and a weakling, that he still refused to, go along with his own red line ultimatum. And I don't know. I just think that's an interesting aspect of his presidency that I'm just curious how people will look at it years from now after he's out of office.
Yeah, it'll be important who writes the history.
Yeah, that too.
But one thing I wanted to go into, because I don't want to, for the people watching or read about it, is there is a fun aspect to the pathology you identified. So you identified how that there's these, the neocons, and then these hangers-on. You mentioned Sam Harris as a sort of new atheist type. mutation that occurs from the neocon orthodoxy, because I do believe that they own the media when it comes to foreign policy, so they are the orthodoxy. So they're the counter to those people who sort of splinter factions, and they're not really connected, but they're still echoing them. There is also another variant that you notice in the film that is, it's just been some schadenfreude for some of us to enjoy, which is Donald Trump taking some of the neocon orthodoxy and then pumping it with steroids and distorting it to an almost amazing level, but to the point where every neocon argument to rev people up and to make people, in a sense, xenophobic or Islamophobic and nationalistic in a sort of indirect way, he's doing it directly and stepping all over them while doing it. It's just been a joy to watch, but just from a spectator perspective. But going to Trump and how, in his interaction with the neocons, and how he's used rage and how he's used some of their rhetoric. I mean, he's both more belligerent and more restrained in a weird sort of way. So go into the Trump phenomenon, which is in the film, and it's a lot of the fun moments that you see elsewhere are documented. It's a nice little comic relief. So go into the Trump phenomenon in the film.
Well, I mean, this was a part of the story that just happened on its own, that I didn't predict. When I originally made this, I finished the whole thing, all 3 parts, a year ago, as like a 4.5 hour movie that nobody was going to watch a 4.5 hour movie. And as I was actually, after I decided to split it into 3 movies and do part 3, this, Trump seemed like he was going to win the nomination. But then I started noticing that the neoconservatives specifically were just completely freaking out over him. And I just didn't expect that to happen. And, as I paid closer attention, it sort of made sense why they were freaking out over him. And, at first I just saw him as this really brash, just completely egotistical narcissist who was just, hitting all these hot button kind of, conservative talking points, really visceral ones. He came out onto the scene with Obama's birth certificate before he started, running for president, he was like offering money if someone could, prove that it was real or something. I don't even remember exactly the challenge he gave to Obama, but what was interesting was as you started to see Donald Trump sort of using, isolate. I hate using this word, but what the neocons refer to as isolationist foreign policy rhetoric. He started to talk about ISIS a lot and talk about, how we need to take him out, we need to destroy him. But there was differences between the way he was talking about it compared to Rubio and Cruz, who were very neocon influenced candidates. Trump was saying things like, we need to just let them kill each other and pick up the remnants. It's kind of like the neocon talking point, of, we got to turn the Middle East into a parking lot and just like bomb the shit out of these people. Donald Trump's almost taking it to the point of, well, ultimately we don't care about these people. We need to protect our country and ourselves. He's taking that neocon rhetoric of militarism and hawkishness and bringing it back to sort of a nationalistic, he's almost removing sort of the international liberalism angle from neoconservatism. So now when he talks about, immigration, it's mixed together with terrorism. I don't think the neocons ever intended, they never wanted xenophobia that they were putting out there after 9/11 to get to that level, to get to the level where people would not want Muslims to be, allowed into this country. All the neoconservatives wanted to do is put out just enough xenophobia and Muslim hatred so that Americans would dehumanize the people we were murdering on a daily basis in the Middle East. And I think that they did that on a PR level. Because that's how these people operate. I mean, even as far back as when Robert Kagan was working in the State Department in the 80s. I mean, he was writing memos explaining that we need to dehumanize the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and humanize the the government supported, the U.S. government supported forces. Is it frozen on your end? Okay. I'm frozen on my end, but I'll trust that it looks okay.
I mean, I think the key point is Trump took it to I think you're hitting it right on the head. He divorced liberal interventionism from the aggressive posture. So what happened ultimately was he still got all the sort of emotional attachment to militarism, but with none of the liberal filling, which the neocons, that's part of their worldview, is that we're the good guys, we're doing something, our cause is just because of certain liberal principles. But Trump was just saying, no, this is in our self-interest, so if we have to use military force, we'll just use military force, and I'll just bomb the hell out of them, quote unquote. And I think that really took them off it, because first off, it's all the power of neoconservatism, which is xenophobic, it's fear-based, it's the politics of fear, but with none of the sort of cosmopolitan trimmings that they kind of like to put on it, because that helps them keep the liberals along with them, and that's, at least previous to now, a winning coalition. So I think Trump did a number on their psyches. It's my view of it. It's kind of fun to watch. But
yeah, and I just wanted to mention that if anyone remembers the way Michael Ledeen used to sound right after 9/11, I mean, and I didn't even have to try very hard to do this, but I found a Michael Ledeen, James Woolsey, and Richard Pearl clip from the American Enterprise Institute in October of 2001, where I would argue that it is the most gratuitous display of neoconservatism in public that I've ever seen. If you watch the entire clip, and Michael Ledeen sounds like Trump at his most cartoonish state, plus mixed together with neoconservatism. He's saying that we need to fight this war and wage a war against all these tyrants, and we need to win. America hates losers. We despise losers. We love winners. This is built into our DNA. I mean, it's almost like he's projecting an intellectual version of what Trump is saying, but with all these sort of like philosophical reasoning behind it. But then Michael Ledeen ends it by saying, and if we wage this war, we'll do very well, and our children will sing great songs about us in the times to come. I mean, and he really believes this, and that you could argue that Trump is kind of a, maybe a running roughshod. He's kind of more of an alpha male. He's not as intellectual, but when if Michael Ledeen is the intellectual version of this, it's really not that much different. I mean, it's what I'm saying is it's far worse.
Yeah. Well, because the Ledeen speech that you show that's really amazing. I mean, that must have been completely. I mean, I reckon people are going to watch the film, hopefully, who watch this, and they'll see that it is really. It's just very unhinged, and he actually at one point even says we have a messianic vision for the world. Which is like that's always the critique of people. It's like, oh, you're all got a messiah complex. This is the worst. I mean, he's actually like embracing it and saying we have a messianic vision for the world, and it's our job and duty, in a sense, to see it through. And it is more scary than what Trump's proposing, because in his vision, in his version of this thing, it's not enough just to protect the country. You have to transform the entire world. I mean, he is kind of that great scene from A Full Metal Jacket where Private Joker is taking photos of these assassinated people in the Vietnamese in this village who apparently were killed by the Viet Cong. And this general comes in and he gives him this speech, and he says, what's up with this? You got born to kill, you got a peace symbol on your lapel, and you got born to kill on your helmet? Is that supposed to be some kind of sick joke? He goes, no, sir, it's the Jungian thing. What? The duality of man. He goes, whatever, forget about that. He goes, listen, we're trying to win this war, because inside every gook is an American trying to get out. And that is really the Ledeen speech.
Oh, it is.
Inside everyone in the world, there is an American trying to get out, that America is a messianic, I mean, not even the general in his scene said this, but this is how unhinged this speech was, and it was on a microphone, I believe at the American Enterprise Institute, and just the implication of what he's advocating. That's what people I think people are, because it's such a hyperbolic age, the actual, but they look used to like inflamed rhetoric. But think about what he's actually saying we're supposed to do, which is to go to every corner of the planet, well, not corner, but everywhere on the planet, and change them into our society. And think of what a monumental task that is, and also the fact that a lot of people don't want to be made into America. So I think his speech is just amazingly unhinged, and to watch it, I still couldn't believe it as I was watching it. So go into that.
Well, good. I'm glad that had the effect on you, because that's the same effect it had on me. I mean, some of these clips that I decided to put in, I watched so many of these clips that there were points where I was falling asleep while, watching some of them, because I was watching them literally all day long, trying to find things. And that was one of them where I was in a hypnagogic, I was falling asleep to it. And I literally woke up the next day just thinking, did I really watch that? And I had to double check to see if it was real. And I had that same experience with that Don and Fred Kagan interview. Same thing happened to me. And luckily, both of them were real. So
luckily,
I'm glad I was able to put those in the movie. But I think that Michael Ledeen clip in particular is a great example of how the neocon attempt to disassociate themselves from Trump because he's a fascist is complete bullshit.
Yeah.
And really, I would argue that their attempt to disassociate from this fascist, Trumpism is really an attempt to rebrand themselves, to disassociate themselves from these clear examples of them flirting with fascism and putting out fascist sounding rhetoric back then. I mean, Michael Ledeen's rhetoric it really does sound more fascist than Trump, because there's a component of world domination with what Michael Ledeen is saying.
Really?
There's not one with Trump. Trump is more of like, you can make the argument that Trump is, is more of a domestic kind of a fascism or whatever. But to me, that's you can't have real fascism, or what people historically describe as fascism, without that world domination messianic kind of component to go with it.
Right. I mean, the difference is Trump is more of a reactionary. These exist in most countries that they have a sort of reactionary, keep Britain British, or keep France French, keep any country a certain way, or and there is a sort of ethno-nationalist aspect to the Trump campaign. There's no doubt about it. But I think the neocons are much more in line with the fascism they so detest, or what they would think of fascism, which is the fascist countries of the 30s, who didn't just say it was enough to keep Germany German, or Spain Spanish. Well, maybe in Spain's case, it was, we have to go get more territory. We have to expand our own nation state. The sort of worst kind of totalitarian imperialism, because that's really, it is a totality or a totalitarianist idea to say that every place in the world must hold our values. That's really expansionist. I mean, it's a definition of expansionism, and it's really it's Wilsonian policy on crack. I mean, even Wilson was more for a sort of order based on a kind of hierarchy that America would be the top of, but it wasn't sort of internationalism. This isn't internationalism. If every country is going to become America, that's not really respecting other countries at all. So I think Ledeen is the most advanced. I don't know if he's just like the most unrestrained neocon.
I would think so. I mean, I think the most candid, maybe.
Candid, okay.
Yeah. I mean, and in private, I'm sure a lot of these people talk like him, or did talk like him. But I think it's noteworthy that he's. I thought it was noteworthy enough of a speech to put in, not just because of the fact that he sounds more fascist than anything Trump has said, but also just because these people do not talk like this anymore. They've learned not to talk like this. Because if they do, it'll undo all of the work that they've been trying to do this whole time to rebrand themselves. And that is ultimately the point of why I made this, is because, they have succeeded in rebranding themselves, and I don't want them to be even more successful at it, and in some small way, if this movie serves as just a reminder to people of how evil and just how awful these people really are, then that's, I'm hoping that that's something positive that could come out of it. So
Right, and isn't that but does that impress you in some sense? I know it impresses me that they have very much, and this just proves it's organized. If there was ever any doubt that these people were not coordinating with each other, that how much they've been able to stick to the notion. Now, maybe they all just were collectively shamed, and therefore they all decided independently that they had to rebrand. But I don't think so. I think they figured out that this doesn't pull. Even now, even the term, by the way, neocon, they don't even like the term anymore. They don't want people to use it. And then they tried to use, well, maybe it's it's just anti-Semitism, or it's just something else. And one of the great parts of your film also that I think people will really benefit from is you bring in clips from a guy, Jim Loeb, who's one of the few people I think in DC or elsewhere who's really looked into neoconservatism, and he, I think, provides what is probably the best definition I've seen. I think he took clips from a speech of his, and he also wrote a blog entry on his site Loblog, that neocons keep trying to distance themselves, they try to rebrand themselves, but they do still have these core beliefs. So talk about that aspect, talk about the charge of anti-Semitism, which is kind of a shield, even though, as Loeb points out, most of American Jews, at least based on polling, don't agree with neoconservative thought, which has actually always been I always thought they were, Jews that I've always known, at least maybe that's a more liberal state in New Jersey, always tend to be people of the left. And so these neocons were kind of confusing to me when I first saw it. So talk about the definition of neoconservatism along with the rebranding.
Yeah. Well, when neoconservatism, first became a term that people were aware of, during the Bush era, it was, Bush's administration was neoconservative. The White House, Cheney, his cabinet was a kettle of neoconservative hawks. Was sort of the understanding of it. But I guess my understanding of it now is that and as Jim Loeb says this in that speech, is that it's not as much of a coherent ideology as it is sort of a worldview that it has largely been dictated by the Holocaust and World War II, and this idea that that we need to stop and essentially a new Adolf Hitler from rising to power at all costs. And the way neoconservatives think is, that means that, and then of course, America's idea of what a new Hitler would be or a totalitarian dictator would be is what matters, because it's America's vision. But yeah, Jim Loeb, was asked in the movie The War Party by Stephen Bradshaw, why is it that it's been, even back then, I think The War Party was made in 2003. So back then, the term neoconservative, by certain people, would be somehow perceived as anti-Semitic code, that it's code for calling someone a Jew. My take on that is I think that it was always set up as a trap. And I would argue that a lot of those people back then who were criticizing neoconservatives maybe leaned a little too hard on the angle that they were Israel firsters and that they were all secretly sort of doing all this for Israel. It never really was for America. I don't really, I think that that's partly true. Some of them may be, but I don't think that was sort of the overriding belief system. I think what Jim Loeb nails it is it's that they believe America and Israel are exceptional nations. And in a lot of ways, and this is just something that I've come to the conclusion of just through researching this. I'm sure that other people have, written this take somewhere along the line that Israel's war on terror, that predated ours, was very inspiring in a lot of ways to American neoconservatives, because here you have this tiny nation surrounded by, hostile, actors or whatever, that's able to, be extremely aggressive towards its neighbors and not give much of a fuck, and be able to assassinate people, torture people, build walls, against all international laws and regulations. I mean, I could see how, as a neoconservative, that would be something to live up to, that this small country can get away with all this shit and wage a total war really against anyone that it perceives as a threat, and get away with it.
Well, right, in a sense that, the criticism of the U.S. has always been that the U.S. does not follow international law. It created a lot of these international laws in Nuremberg, and as well as after the Soviet Union collapsed, but it doesn't actually follow any of them. And what the neocons have always stressed, and this goes back to Ronald Reagan, where a lot of these guys go back to, is that, international law is fine and good, but it's not meant for great powers like the United States. They have to be able to break the law. And Nicaragua is an interesting example. There's something called the International Court of Justice, and it's actually it's kind of an arbitrary setup where if you don't agree to have your case adjudicated, they can't take you to court. But if you agree, then you're supposed to stand by the ruling. So Nicaragua, the U.S. mined Nicaragua harbors in the 80s, and Nicaragua took the U.S. to court in the International Court of Justice, and the U.S. agreed to participate because it wasn't going to say it wouldn't participate. And then the International Court of Justice ruled against the U.S. and said it broke the law, mining their harbors, and pay the Nicaraguans restitution. And then the U.S. said, piss off, we're not paying you anything. So just like ignore the entire verdict. So there is something, I agree there's some sort of kinship in the sense that Israel breaks international law, and if not for the U.S. veto in the Security Council, would probably already be under sanctions. And that probably is some sort of the exceptional nature. Exceptional in that sense that they don't follow international law, and they're the exception to legal workings. But so I think it's that. But I agree that it's not an Israeli first dynamic, because I don't think it's not that they favor one over the other. It's that there's a sort of general worldview that encapsulates both, and that there's no difference between the two countries because really this is a messianic vision, and it's not really even about the borders of the United States. It's a global vision. So I agree that I think Jim Loeb kind of nails it. It is a worldview, and it does lead to a syndrome that's been going on for a while. I remember watching an old speech with LBJ talking about Vietnam War, and he talked about this is just like Munich. If we lay down for Ho Chi Minh, this is what happened in Munich. And this is that's kind of the domino theory in a sense, right? And the domino theory is in a sense appeasement, and the idea of appeasement. So I agree that it is a new Hitler syndrome. I don't think that's restricted. The neocons are a diverse group of people, and anybody can be an imperialist. You can do it, kids. Anybody can be an imperialist. You don't need to have a certain background. I think what you point out to, and by quoting a really interesting documentary called Arguing the World, which has some portions in there, particularly the Irving Kristol section, is that the conservative movement was kind of tired and run out, particularly by the liberals. I mean, they had faced incredible defeats. Barry Goldwater, who people talk about as this great intellectual sort of focus or origin of a lot of these victories, was completely obliterated in I think the 1964 election by Lyndon Johnson. And conservatism was on the ropes, and the New York intellectuals, who were all mostly former Trotskyists, came in and breathed new life and understood the power of ideas. And many of them happened to be Jewish, so I think there is a weird conflation that's not correct at all. It's just this group of intellectuals provided a lot of I think firepower with things like the Public Interest and other, and American Enterprise Institute and these other sort of organizations that would actually understand, because they had spent their lives arguing the world, quote unquote, which is to say engaging in intellectual debate in New York, that they understood the power of these ideas that maybe conservatives didn't quite get, or at least, William Buckley got it, but I guess maybe generally didn't get. So I think that's their value and power. And I don't think the Israeli first thing is really true. I think it was a slam, and it doesn't. Wouldn't see that as driving the debate today. I don't think there's any constituency in the U.S. really for anti-Israeli politics anyway. So I'm not sure who that would even be appealing to label them all, despite many non-Jews who are neoconservatives, and part of this group. I think that's actually a very large, good constituency. If you're running for office, or you're putting I have the support of, I'm very pro-Israel. I haven't heard anybody in any election say, run against Israel yet. So, yeah, I agree. That part of your film, I think, helps people understand the contours more, because I think there is a simplification with neoconservatism, but I think Jim Loeb lays it out. I mean, what do you think about defining neoconservatism and then looking at who would join it now? I mean, who's actually, that's a good question I want to leave with. Who's this new generation of neoconservatives? Because some of them make a foray into the film series.
Yeah, well, I wanted to go back to something you said about Irving Kristol and how these sort of Trotskyites breathe new life into the conservative movement. There's a lot of stuff I actually couldn't use in the movie that, unfortunately, I mean, it didn't fit into the story I was trying to tell. But there's a lot of candid admissions from Irving Kristol, speaking as sort of almost like a secular Jew. He's not religious at all. I don't even know. I mean, maybe he's an atheist. I'm not sure. But talks at length about the importance of bringing back religion into politics and how big of a deal that was, and how important it was, and how much of a role it now plays. Because originally, when these neoconservatives sort of came onto the scene, they weren't bringing in religion. It was sort of a movement detached from a religious identity. But as it evolved, I think that they realized the power of that. And it is kind of fascinating how a lot of these neoconservatives were more, secular Jews who were essentially using the energy and the passion and the engine of like the evangelical Christian rise in the 70s. And the Reagan era was kind of defined by that as well. And a lot of these neoconservatives were in his administration. And, in Robert Kagan's writings, we see a little hint of just how important it was to sort of reach out to the religious community in the United States to wage foreign policy in South America, with this, spreading anti-Sandinista propaganda to the religious community here in this country.
Right, because they opposed the promulgation of liberation theology, which they thought was a sort of stealth Marxist version of Christianity. And he was smart, and a lot of other people who appealed to people in the evangelical community to say not only should we stop communism, but people like Father Romero or other people in Latin America who are talking about liberation theology, which became an issue actually in 2008 because Obama's pastor Jeremiah Wright, no relation, had said these sort of very quote-unquote anti-American things, and they said this is a product of liberation theology. And really? Yeah, and so that had been a great cudgel. A lot of people, religious people, looked the other way on some of the atrocities in Latin America during the 80s because they saw it as a war, a kind of sectarian war against this sect called liberation theology, which was this Christian sect that was very left-wing. So Pat Robertson and other people kind of look the other way, and while at the same time I agree with what you're talking about, which is the moral majority, which is blatantly Christian. In fact, and has a revisionist history of the United States as Christian, that the founders were all Christians, which isn't true. All these other things, and they teamed up. And I remember seeing that clip actually about Irving Kristol saying religion's so important, and how. And then it's like I'm thinking to myself, wait, isn't this guy say he was a Trotskyist who didn't really believe in religion, but it was still useful for society? So I think they made very cunning alliances, even though they didn't necessarily believe in a lot of it. But there's actually a great point in the film's The Power of Nightmares, where someone, I forget who it is, quotes Neocon says, when Stalin talked to the Pope, he said, "Oh yeah, the Pope said that. How many divisions does he have?" He said, "Well, when the moral majority teamed up with us, we had divisions, meaning we had voters, we had people who we were in a coalition with." So I think that's something that marks and the rebranding, I think, plays into this, a sort of opportunism, a sort of, a purpose, a clear end, but a Machiavellian sense of the ends justify the means. So, if we have to team up with these people who probably don't really like secular Jews that much, oh, whatever. Or these people who wouldn't like atheists or wouldn't like former Trotskyists, whatever, this is what it takes to win. So Absolutely. I think there's that opportunism. Do you see opportunism as fundamental to neoconservatism, even though that would play in more to it not being so doctrinaire, but more of a worldview, because, well, then you're very free to do whatever you need to do tactically.
I think opportunism is completely, it's crucial, because that quote you said earlier, I don't know who it's from, but about like when it boils over, or like when these moments sort of boil over, you can seize on them, and the neoconservatives completely depend on those moments in time.
Right.
And I mean, just from a, just anecdotal story really quickly about my just sort of entry point into politics is a long time ago, when I was more of a, like a prankster. I wasn't really doing journalism. My friend and I made a fake beheading video in 2004, and we uploaded it to a file sharing network, and we sort of saw the engine of this like I sort of had to, it was like a real-time, intense 24 hours education on how the neocons are so opportunistic and seize on these moments, because the media, without doing any fact-checking whatsoever, put my video on television as a real Al-Qaeda
really?
Real Al-Qaeda beheading video, yeah. AP and Reuters ran the story that an American soldier was beheaded in Iraq, and there was a video made of it. And they did not do any fact-checking whatsoever. My friend who was the victim in the video, he said name and phone number in the video. So basically what happened is AP or Reuters, before running that story, could have called him, try to talk to him, done any research. They decided not to, ran with it. And so sort of we saw what happened, is that this sort of neocon push at the time. I mean, this was in 2004, not 2003. So this was right after
Nick Berg?
Yeah, right after the Nick Berg and the Abu Ghraib prison scandal. So, I guess the only reason I bring that up is because that moment in time, if it was real and not a hoax, would have been an amazing opportunity for the neocons. And I sort of like saw the media moving, they were trying to make an opportunity of it before they figured out it was fake. Because an American soldier being beheaded in Iraq would have been an amazing way to counter sort of the torture scandal that was happening in the background.
Right. Neutralized it.
And that's kind of what was so interesting about it is, the Nick Berg beheading video it helped do that too. It was kind of became this mantra or talking point where it's like, well, these people cut people's heads off. Like, they are all out barbarians. What are we even doing, like, pussyfooting around in Iraq? We just need to take them out. Like, who cares if we made some soldier, prisoners get naked and circle jerk? Like, this is just crazy that they're cutting people's heads off. That was kind of the narrative. And that experience that I had sort of really, it was just an intense understanding of how those opportunities can be used, I guess is what I'm saying.
Wow, yeah, that's a good crash course in understanding, watching the sausage get made of the media, which is, if we really want to go into, they don't fact check really anything, most of it. But but as we're drawing to a close on that note, that you're pranking the mainstream media. Now that you're done the series, Lord knows there can't be a fourth edition, right? Where this is a solid 8 hours?
7.5.
7.5.
Yeah.
So you've gone through all this. You've done meticulous research. You put together a pretty coherent narrative. I think anybody who's trying to understand this needs to watch these videos, really understand American politics. What are some of the lessons you've learned? What's the journey? There you go. This is the journey question. This is the Oprah journey question. What have you learned making this trilogy of films? What have you learned you didn't know before, and has it changed how you think about things at all?
Yeah, I don't want to get myself into the position I was in last time I came on here, where I gave you an extremely depressing response. But I hate to say, that what I've learned in making this documentary is that things are a lot scarier and more harder to stop. This war engine, this push for war, sort of the war on terror narrative, this idea that that we're in a state of perpetual war. I see all that stuff as the challenge in stopping it feels larger and just on such a gargantuan level to me now compared to what it seemed like before.
You're more overwhelmed?
I'm more overwhelmed and worried about us changing direction from this. And I wish I could say otherwise. I wish that, I could say that people learned from their mistakes of blindly supporting Obama and going along with his foreign policy, or what happened in Syria or Ukraine. But I guess I'm really, I almost sound like Cheney at the end of my movie, but I'm really worried about the direction things are going on. And I guess, one really clear example of that, and this is something that, you may not agree with me on, that, I believe that Obama was kind of passively resisting getting deeper into Ukraine as sort of one of his last decisions. He chose not to fully send offensive weapons to Ukraine, even though it was voted on overwhelmingly. For some reason, he has held that off to the extent that they had voted. In the bill, I don't remember the amount of money, but it was sort of open license to send a full arsenal to the Ukrainian army. Yeah. He has not done that, and unfortunately, whoever gets into the presidency next will. I mean, there's a very low likelihood that they won't do that, and that they won't put all these things in that Obama was even just doing foot dragging on. So even just in that regard, I'm concerned and worried for what's going to happen next.
Yeah, no, I think your film points out, for people who are looking to watch this before the 2016 election. Hopefully they will if they're watching it now. Yeah. They're going to get, I think, something that I've talked about and other people have talked about, and there's a new policy program with Bob Kagan as a co-signer, with Michelle Flournoy, who's going to likely be the Secretary of Defense. I mean, the neocons are back. They're coming in. If Hillary Clinton is elected, they're coming back hard. And I agree, actually, with you. I think Obama has tried to drag his feet a little bit and has tried to avoid what him and his, I guess unofficially it's called "don't do stupid shit," quote unquote, policy. This is what Foreign Policy magazine called it. I think he actually has been doing that. I think he's tried, as bad as he's been on certain issues, he has tried to not go all in. Call it sort of this, someone who just takes sort of half measures, which I think it actually kind of is. He won't say no, but he won't say yes. And as bad as that is, I think you're about to get to someone who's going to say yes a lot. And I think there's going to be regime change all throughout the Middle East. I think there's going to be a more aggressive stance in Latin America. I think you're going to see unbelievable irresponsibility with Russia. So I actually think you're right about Obama kind of being better than, I think we might learn, I think in a few years' time we might really learn to appreciate Obama's cruise missile liberalism and drone strike liberalism. We really might learn to appreciate it, because I think you're going to get a hardcore neocon if Hillary gets in. I don't know.
Yeah,
do you agree with that?
I mean, I do agree with it, and I mean, and I don't hold out much hope for Trump either. Especially after hearing that, I mean, we already know John Bolton is advising him, and then Newt Gingrich might be his VP apparently. So, and I didn't show this in the movie, but the fourth person sitting at that table with Ledeen, Pearl, and Woolsey is Newt Gingrich, and he actually says some of the craziest things about anthrax. I mean, it's almost like Newt Gingrich is listening to all these because I don't think Newt Gingrich is quite in that same sphere. He's a little bit different, but he's listening to all of them talk about anthrax and Saddam and what would happen if somebody decided to put thousands of letters of anthrax. He's kind of listening to all this stuff, and he sort of pitches the war and the rationale for why we need to wage the war against Iraq based on the anthrax in a more concrete and cohesive and sort of laid out way than any of these neocons ever said out loud. Like, it's almost like he's filtering their information and sort of relaying back to the audience, yeah, like we should go into Iraq because we can't wait for, you know, someone to do another type of anthrax letter attack. And, you know, James is right, you know, Richard is right for all these reasons. And he kind of, if you read the transcript, it's actually really impressive the way that Newt Gingrich kind of just goes fully on board with all this stuff too. So I went off a little bit of a tangent there, but I'm just saying that I think we're screwed either way. I mean, but if Trump gets into office, I think the only interesting thing for me really that I want to see is the press becoming more adversarial, but it'll be in a phony way. So
yeah, no, it'll be totally phony. It'll be totally phony.
I mean, and I, you know, and I say this sometimes, you know, and I don't even know if I'd really fully agree with myself saying this, but like when Obama was president, like I feel like Fox News became better, you know, like they became a little bit more, you know, there were some times where I was like, oh, they're doing real journalism here, you know. I mean, then there was moments like that, so maybe there will be under Trump, you know, because the press already hates him so much. So but that's a little tiny glimmer of something positive to hope for.
Well, okay. Thank you for your non-depressing closing out. We'll leave it there. Please watch A Very Heavy Agenda 3, Maintaining the World Order, and I think you can probably get all 3 now. It's a great watch. I will link to all this stuff, and thank you so much. See ya.
Thank you. I wanted to mention really quick. I wanted to just inform people that we're selling a box set of all 3 movies, and there will be 30 minutes of bonus material on an extra DVD with that.
Even more footage.
Even more.
There you go. All right. Thank you so much, Robbie.
Have a good one.
Peace.